Hello everybody, my name is Jeremy Siskind. I am the author of this book, which is called Playing Solo Jazz Piano. And today, I want to give you a bit of a deep dive on shearing or closed position voicings. Two different names to refer to the same thing. There's going to be 6 mini lessons here. The first one is basics of shearing voicings. The second one is how to ornament those shearing voicings. The third and fourth are 2 levels of how to actually use these to harmonize a jazz melody. The fifth one is some of my favorite tips and tricks, including how to use these at a faster tempo. And then the 6th one is ways to actually incorporate this into solo piano playing. So, for a little bit of an introduction, shearing voicings, that's kind of a nickname that jazz pianists give this type of voicing, named after George Shearing, the great blind British pianist who was just such a whiz at these voicings and just a great overall pianist. And we also call these, more technically, closed position voicings. And what that means is that they're taking place within an octave. So the first thing that you have to know about these voicings is that we're using them to harmonize a melody. So if we have this simple melody, the voicings are going to change with every melody note. And there's always going to be an octave beneath the melody. And all these voicings are going to happen within that octave. Okay. And you can hear in that short example, I always think of these voicings as sounding like a big band saxophone section. And particularly, I really think of the bassy saxophone section when I hear these voicings. Now, these voicings are related to another type of voicing you might have heard of called drop 2. And usually I suggest that pianists master these shearing or closed position voicings before getting to drop 2. And drop 2, let me just play it for you. It's no longer within an octave. You can hear they sound a little bit lighter, airier, and some say more modern. But these voicings are a great start before getting to those drop 2 voicings. So let's dive in with our first lesson, which is the basics of these voicings. So as I said, we're going to use these to harmonize a melody. And so we're thinking, yes, about the chord symbol, but we also have to think about the melody note and how it relates to the chord. So for my first lesson on shearing voicings, what I like to do is use this 8-note scale that I've given you at the top of the screen here. And usually, if you know that the major scale is 7 notes, so we've added a note, this highlighted note that's either the flat 6 or the sharp 5, depending on how you want to look at it. Okay, so we have this scale. And incidentally, some people call this scale the major bebop scale, if that's useful to you. But this is going to be great to harmonize in these shearing voicings for just a very first step. And what we're doing here is I've given each note a number. And the odd numbers we're going to take together and make a chord. So it's 1, 3, 5, and the 7th note of the scale, which is going to sound like the 6th note of the major scale. But because we have that extra flat 6 in there, this becomes an odd number note as the 7th. When we put these together, we get what we'd call a C6 chord, right? C, E, G, which makes a C triad, plus A, the 6th. You might also recognize these. These are the notes of an A minor 7 chord. But since we're in the key of C overall, we're going to call it C6, okay? When we're doing these chords, we're going to almost always, have 4 notes in the right hand and 1 note in the left, okay? So what I'm doing is I'm using those notes of the C6 chord, C, E, G, and A, and I'm fitting them all between C and C. And then as we harmonize any of those odd numbered notes, the C, E, G, and A, we're going to use an inversion of the C6 chords. We're going to use those same 4 notes, doubling the outside note, right? We're always within an octave. And for the middle, for the filling of the sandwich, we're adding whichever notes are missing. So here it's C, E, G, A, and then E, of course, repeated at the bottom. Same thing on G, same thing on A. So it's basically the same chord in 4 different inversions. Now, we also want to take the even number notes. So it's going to be notes 2, 4, 6, and 8 from the scale. And when you put them together, we get D, F, G sharp, and B. You could probably recognize that sound. That's a diminished chord. Now, diminished chords are symmetrical chords, meaning that they have the same interval pattern no matter which note you start them on. So we're just going to choose to call this a B diminished because B is the 7th note of the C scale, and that's often diminished anyway. So any of these notes, these even numbered notes, we're going to harmonize with the notes of a diminished chord. And notice it's very easy because diminished chords already have 4 notes, so you don't really have to think much about which notes from the diminished chord to choose. So now if we're going to go ahead and play this scale, I'm going to play in the left hand just a single note scale. And this is key because a big part of these voicings is creating an aural illusion. The illusion that you're connecting and later that you're ornamenting in both hands, whereas in fact it's the left hand doing most of the work. So here in the right hand, I'm going to be doing every other pitch is going to be C6, and then B diminished, and then C6, and then B diminished. So C6, B diminished, C6, B diminished. Another way to think of this, which is going to be really relevant later, is that these odd numbered notes, the C6 notes, we're treating as chord tones. So if we're in the key of C, it makes sense that the 1, 3, 5 are chord tones, and we often treat the 6 as a chord tone as well. And then these in-between notes, the even number notes, we're treating as non-chord tones. So that's going to come back in a couple lessons. And then the first assignment that I give my students as you're getting used to this is pick some nursery rhymes or really simple melodies that just stay right within a major scale and harmonize them using this pattern, using either 6 chords on one hand or diminished chords for the non-chord tones, the even numbered notes. So for example, this final line of system of music here is the beginning of the melody of Mary Had a Little Lamb, right? And so here we're going to harmonize the E with a C6, right? C, A, G, and E, and 2 E's on the outside. Then we'll harmonize the D with the diminished, then the C with the C6, and so on. So you can do that with Frere Jacques or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star or Happy Birthday, you know, whatever you want to do, and try it in some different keys too. As you transpose, of course, if you're doing the same thing in E flat major, you're going to be using an E flat 6 for the chord tones and a D diminished for the non-chord tones. All right. For lesson 2, I want to talk about ornamentation, which is really key for this sound. And we'll do this before we talk about how to do more complex things in terms of other keys and other harmonies and other types of chords. So if we're sticking with this Mary Had a Little Lamb for the first few notes, the first thing that we want to use a ton in this style is grace notes. And so it's going to be the left hand doing all of this ornamentation. So instead of, we could do, and notice it could be just a single grace note, it could be 2 grace notes, or it could be even more. I love this because, again, it provides an illusion. It sounds like the whole thing's kind of scooping, like a good saxophone section might together, but in fact, it's only the lower voice scooping. It's kind of just a fun, expressive effect. Another device that I use a lot with this is ghost notes. You may or may not have heard of ghost notes. Ghost notes are notes that aren't really meant to be heard. They're played softly, but they just provide a little bit of extra rhythmic jolt. Usually when I'm selecting a ghost note, I try to pick a note from the key, like the root or the fifth, that people aren't even going to notice. Ghost notes to me, if you're like when you're jumping rope and you have the main jump, but then you have that little hop to keep time in between, that's a ghost note. And so oftentimes when we have quarter notes, we add in eighth note ghost notes to kind of increase the swing feel. So it might be. So you can see it's with my left hand pinky there that I'm adding in those little ghost notes. And that also adds a lot of color. Another option is turns. And turns can take a variety of forms. If we're going downwards, it's nice to just kind of go up by a step and back. And they could be diatonic or they could be chromatic. And if you're staying on the same note, like we do in Mary Had a Little Lamb for that section, we could go above and below a note. Is happening in the left hand, and that's really going to be true across different parts of this style. All right, now that's all well and good, but it doesn't really help us to harmonize a jazz melody. So what are we going to do in terms of harmonizing a jazz melody? It's actually a similar process in this sense. We're going to basically take the notes and divide them into one of two camps. We're either going to call them chord tones, or we're going to call them non-chord tones. And when we have a chord tone, we're going to harmonize it with the notes from the chord. And we have some flexibility here. We're usually going to want to include the third and seventh, or often the third and sixth. And then we can add in color tones, like the fifth or the ninth. We could add in the root sometimes. And on dominant chords, we can add in some altered tones, like a sharp 5 or a flat 9. For non-chord tones, we're going to keep this simple for now. We're going to harmonize them with diminished chords, okay, just like we did in our very first instance. So for notes that aren't part of the chord, we'll just harmonize them with a diminished chord based on that note. So if it's a B, we'll harmonize it with a B diminished. If it's an E flat, we're going to harmonize it with an E flat diminished seventh. And we'll always use a diminished seventh chord because we like seventh chords in jazz. Now, this isn't that complicated, but it's not that simple either, because you might have this question of how do I know whether something's a chord tone or not? And you're going to have to really think about the function. So with certain notes, like a root, a third, or a fifth, they're almost always going to be chord tones. But in jazz, we have a bunch of other notes, like the 13th, the 7th, the 9th, which may or may not be chord tones depending on how they're used. So you're going to have to look, is this note kind of a stable part of the chord, or is it an in-between note where you're kind of using it to jump to something else? Like, are you using it as a passing tone or a neighbor tone? So I wrote out two measures in C here, and they both include a B natural, but they're doing something very different. So in the first measure, we have this. Okay, so the chord's C major 7, and we have two C's with a B in between. And so here, I would argue that that B is acting as a non-chord tone. It's a lower neighbor to the C. So when we're harmonizing this, we would harmonize the C's with a C major 6 or a C major 7, and then the B with a B diminished. Okay. And the reason I'm saying it's a non-chord tone is because it's short on the one hand, and secondly, it's just a half step away from its goal note, which I think is that C natural there. So it looks exactly like it's doing what a neighbor tone does, which is that it's kind of entering into a new note by a half step. Now in the second measure, we again have a B. But this time, I think the situation is very different. Now the B is, first, it's on the downbeat, it's held out a long time, and it's not neighboring anything else. It doesn't look like a neighbor tone, it also doesn't look like it's passing, that it's being passed through to get anywhere else. So here, we have no choice but to harmonize it as a chord tone. I think this is acting as the seventh of that C major 7. So I'm going to harmonize it with a major 7th chord. I'm going to harmonize it with the notes of C major 7. So you could see that it's not, I can't give you a simple formula and say, always treat the 7th this way. It really depends on the context. So you have to use your smart theoretical thinking. Now, let's look at 4 measures of Bye Blackbird so we can see how this works. Okay. So the first measure I think is pretty straightforward. We have the third of the chord repeated 4 times. So we're going to harmonize that with notes from F major. So we'll harmonize it. Let's use the root. Let's use the 5th. And depending on what sound you want, you can go with a 6th chord, or you could go with a major 7th chord. You can hear that in the major 7th, these two rub up against each other, so it's maybe a little bit more, not dissonant, but colorful sounding than this, which is a little bit more classic sounding. Now, looking at the second measure, that B flat, I definitely want to treat it as a non-chord tone, right? Because it's a neighbor tone. And it's the 4th, which usually we treat as a non-chord tone because it's dissonant in that it needs to be resolved. So we're going to harmonize that with a B flat diminished. So I'm going to take D flat, E, and G. And then that'll resolve back to our F major chord. So now, if you're looking at my hand, you'll notice that I'm playing these 2 notes with my thumb, which makes life a lot easier because look at how smoothly I can move my right hand. I call that the corner thumb, and I actually wrote a whole thing about that in my book, Playing Solo Jazz Piano. It's really useful for all kinds of chords to be able to make your life easier and make your hand position smoother. Because look, if I didn't have that, I'd have to go. It's actually kind of a tough move, but from here, it's very simple. So next, we have a really interesting case. We have an A natural and a G on G minor 7. So A natural is the 9th, A natural is the 9th of G minor. So we could harmonize it as a chord tone. We could harmonize it with notes of a G minor 7. And if I did that, I think we need the 7th and the 3rd, B flat and F. And then we have this big space in between, so I'm going to add in the 5th. There's other possible voicings. You could use the 11th, maybe the 13th. That might be weird. But this is probably my standard voicing. So I have A in the left hand, B flat, D, F, and A in the right. And then what's kind of nice if we do that, if we then resolve to the G melody, we could keep all of those notes because we're harmonizing them both with notes from the G minor 7 chord. So now I have G in my left hand, B flat, D, F still in the middle, and G on the outside. And again, watch my fingering. I'm using my whole hand so I barely have to move, right? I'm not going. I'm using my 5th finger to play the melody, then my 4th. Or we could look at that A and say, well, it kind of looks like a neighbor tone. It's resolving to the G. So let's treat that as a non-chord tone. And that actually works beautifully too. So then we'd harmonize the A with an A diminished. Remember, we're harmonizing all of our non-chord tones with diminished 7th chords. So here's your A diminished, A, C, E flat, G flat, and A. That sounds nice too. Okay. And then we have our C7. So there we have 2 options. I think they both work. It's just a matter of your stylistic preference more than anything. There's not a right and a wrong. All right, then we get to this G on the C7. That's the 5th. You probably are going to want to treat it as a chord tone because it's the only note against that chord. So it's the 5th. We need the 3rd and the 7th, B flat and E. And then let's fill in the 9th in between for a sophisticated sound. And then since it's a dominant chord, if we want to make it a flat 9 or a sharp 9, the sharp 9 maybe doesn't sound that great. Flat 9 sounds good. And notice what ends up happening with flat 9 is we get a diminished chord. We can't escape these diminished chords. So we could have this chord G, B flat, D flat, E, G. Going on to this F major 7, we also have a choice to make. So again, we have the 9th in the melody. And again, we could harmonize it as a chord tone. So here, since we have the 9th, we'd add the 3rd and the 7th, the F major 7, A and E. And then we could add in the 5th to fill in that gap in the middle. Or we could harmonize it as a non-chord tone, as a diminished chord. So there would be G diminished. And we'd resolve to F. I think either way works. So here's one version of these first 4 measures of Bye Blackbird. Here's another version. They both sound great. I used very different chords for the 2 of them, but they both sound really elegant. So you are going to have some decisions to make regarding how to harmonize some of these notes. That's part of the fun of it. Now, in fact, you have a ton of different decisions if you start using some other devices and maybe pulling in some knowledge from other places. So I have kind of 4 other techniques that you can think about. And we're going to start on the left-hand side of the page here with what we call planing. And so planing means that you're going to take a voicing and you're going to move it the equivalent of the melody. So if the melody goes up a half step, you're going to move that entire voicing up a half step. If the melody goes up a minor third, you're going to take that exact same voicing and you're going to transpose it up a minor third. So that means that you're going to get what we call parallel voicings. That if you have a major 7th voicing, it's going to be different major 7ths. If you have a dominant 7th voicing, you're going to continue writing dominant 7th voicings. So this is lovely, and look at, it's really this chord that changes. So here I have F major 7, and then I'll just go up a half step to G flat major 7. Very colorful. And in fact, some people play the end of this melody. We could do the same thing. We take this F major 7. That becomes A flat major 7 as we're transposing up a minor third, excuse me. So that's a little bit more modern sounding. It's a little bit more colorful, right? Right below that, we have the device of tonicization. And this is something we're doing constantly in jazz. We're adding in little 5 chords to create small 5-to-1 progressions. So, I mark these first 2 measures as just staying on F major. But we could, since we love creating some motion and some tension and release in jazz harmony, we could make it kind of 2 small C7 to F major cadences. So listen here. So C7 to F, C7 to F, and it creates a lot more color. And one reason is that we love dominant chords in jazz, because that's where we can add the most altered tone. The third thing, now we're in the top right-hand quadrant here, is this is just one of my favorite tricks. And in this case, we're going to just throw out the chord symbols. We don't care about this F major anymore. We're going to harmonize each note with other notes from its half-whole octatonic scale. Why, you ask? Because it sounds cool is the answer. I'm not sure that it's super sound from a theoretical perspective. And what you want to do here, which I think makes it sound really neat, is to have a half step between your left-hand melody note and the lowest note of your voicing. So here we have, so I'm using the octatonic scale, the half-whole based on A. And then as I go to this B, then I'm using the half-whole octatonic scale based on B. So the downside of this, of course, is that you can't hear the harmony very well. So you probably don't want to do it for the entire piece, but you could throw it in bits and pieces, and it's really colorful. If I wanted to go normal voicings now, if you go in and out of it, then it just sounds like kind of this cool, thickened line, blurry color. Lastly, it can be kind of fun to try some diatonic voicings here. And you could even experiment with triads. If you hear Oscar Peterson play this tune, I think he plays it in B flat, and he's doing this kind of voicing. And he actually just goes for like a 4-to-1 plagal cadence, I believe. So back to F, sorry. We could just go to G minor. From F, just kind of looking, at our diatonic 7th chords. So we don't diminished, even though they're typical of the sound. So you can practice your diatonic scale, harmonizing it diatonically. And that's another way, another method that you can use to use these voicings. All right, on to lesson 5, which is some of my tips and tricks, particularly as you're playing faster. One is that you can, if you're playing arpeggios, you can do what I call a finger transfer. And this is the one time when I'm encouraging people to not have just one note in the left hand. So this helps you play a lightning fast arpeggio. So if I want to go, I'm starting with 4 notes in my left hand, 4 notes in my right hand, 1 in my left, and then I go to 3 and 2, and then I go to 2 and 3, and then I go to 1 and 4. Even though I'm still getting the right effect, right? Otherwise I'd have to go, which is super hard. Right? And if you know you're going to do an arpeggio up, you can start with 4 notes in the left. And then transfer notes into the right. So this can allow you to do some lightning fast arpeggio playing. So it's worth practicing this exercise that I have here. I'll move my hands in so you can see a little bit better. We can very easily get from 4 in the right, 1 in the left, to all 5 in the left without changing hand positions. If you want to play fast with this style, it is possible, but you're going to leave some chords out. This first kind of exercise that I wrote is something that I've heard both Dave Brubeck and Oscar Peterson play kind of verbatim. And looking at it, you're going to be playing 3 triplets in the left, but only the first and third triplets in the right. But it sounds fast. Here's another oral illusion for you. Right? It's really fun, and especially because your right hand doesn't have to change positions a lot, right? It's actually going. But it sounds like you're working really, really hard, when in fact you're not working that hard. But this principle of playing more notes in the left than in the right is really essential. For example, I was helping a student play octave in this style, and if you don't know the first few lines of that melody, and so if you're going to try to do a chord for every melody note, you got to move real fast. It's pretty hard to get it smooth. Possible, but hard. So what I would generally recommend instead would be, to hear that I'm leaving out that middle chord, I'll do it in a slow motion. And this is true all over. For example, I was working on this concept with Clifford Brown's solo on Joy Spring. I can't really do it anymore, but he has this lightning fast part in the middle where he goes. So, I could never go. It's way too hard. If I could do that. So you have to be really smart about which chords you include and which you leave out. Lastly, this tip is less for moving fast, but you can play around with moving inner voices. So coming back to Bye Blackbird, I experimented with what might happen if I took these 2 notes in the middle and I moved them up and down instead of just repeating the same chord. What if I went... get some more color. So, and it could be, I could have just moved this one sounds. So feel free to experiment, move some of those notes around by half step. All right, so I told you that the name of my book is Playing Solo Jazz Piano. So how can you use these for playing solo piano? A few different things to think about. The first is that you can add a bass note underneath sometimes. So for example, if I'm playing Bye Blackbird, now look, my left hand's going to be really spread. Also get a little bit more creative. You know, I could go a little bit off the beaten path. So there's that planing that I showed you before. I could just play a triad here. So my left hand now is performing two duties. And you might be wondering, you know, you told me that I need to connect my left hand. And that's true. But in a melody like this, I can connect it pretty well with just my thumb. You know, if I'm playing confirmation, I'm not going to be able to do that. I'm going to need more of my fingers. But for this moment, I feel pretty good about being able to connect mostly using just my thumb. A second thing that you can do here is kind of have a call and response. So you can play these shearing or closed position voicings in the middle of the piano, and then you could fill in some kind of a chordal response in the gap. So. It could be both hands. You could get a little bit fancy. It's also fun, you know, since the shearing voicings almost by nature have to be towards the middle of the piano, you could do responses on the outer sides of the piano. But you get the idea. You can kind of experiment with where the responses are going to happen. And then probably the most common way, you know, that people do this is they just come to these shearing voicings kind of for a split second among another texture. So if you're playing. Is that shearing voicings don't always have to be used with the main melody. They're harmonizing a melody, but it could be, you know, that they're harmonizing a background, a counter melody of some sort. So. And in fact, I love using shearing voicings when I'm comping. And I think of it like a saxophone background in a big band. So that doesn't always have to be the star of the show. All right, if you've made it this far, thank you. You've been very interested, I guess, in shearing and closed position voicing. I hope you got a lot out of this session. And I will remind you, as always, I am the author of this book, Playing Solo Jazz Piano, and I would love to send you a signed copy if you order it from my website, jeremysiskind.com. That's always appreciated. If you're international, it does sell from Amazon as well, but I always really, really appreciate it when you guys order directly from me, because I get to keep more of the money. Stay tuned. There's going to be more videos coming your way every week about jazz piano concepts. So, you know the drill. Like and subscribe, and enjoy these shearing voicings. It's a really fun sound.